I wanted to say a few words briefly. Briefly. Every time I hear the word briefly, it makes me think of what somebody once said. The Gettysburg Address was brief, but it was to the point. A few people have asked over the last few weeks why a School of Architecture would be interested in putting on a lecture series that didn't include architects. It's very clear with us. Our intentions, I think, are very clear. What I decided to do is I very quickly wrote down some of the things that we've been talking about over the last 8 months as to what the purpose is of a School of Architecture, and I think what the interests are of architects as they start to broaden beyond the sort of artificial boundaries that have been set over the years. All disciplines are investigating aspects of their tradition, as well as exploring new ground by questioning the very nature of their discipline. Curiosity, the life source of any inventor's creative urge. The explorations in recent years have moved beyond the conventional territorial boundaries separating these very disciplines. We're now beginning to use ideas conceived within these artificial boundaries as instruments or as means for exploring new ground outside. This provides us with a new vantage point from which to view our ideas and to ultimately understand them. A reverberation of ideas, I believe. The broadening of one's own world. We believe insights are gained from this. The semester's lecture series, which was put together, sponsored by the students, and put together under the leadership of a student, Phil Silberman, with the assistance of our staff and with the advice of Roland Coate, I believe satisfies an interest that we have once again of using architecture and more specifically SCI-Arc as a vehicle for trying to make connections between all of the disciplines as once occurred. Here's Phil to introduce Robert.
Good evening. Before I do introduce Robert, I just would like to thank the people who helped me put this whole series together. Thank you. You know who you are. Robert Winter is a noted musicologist who has lectured and performed all across the United States and Canada. He's best known here in Southern California to the audience here for his nationally broadcast Mozart and Beethoven series, and as a pre-concert commentator for the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. His radio series called Pacific Coast Highway premiered last summer nationwide and locally here on KUSC. I'm very pleased and happy to introduce to you tonight Robert Winter.
Thank you all for coming out this evening to listen to a musician talk about space. I can't say that would have gotten me out of the driveway. Thing. Farm. In fact, it probably behind the fiasco center in the late 60s. Acoustics and architecture. Contact that what you get nowadays, generally in terms of interaction,
who's coming through. Concert hall. Seems reasonable. Want me to sort of hold it like this? How's that? Are we?
Perfect. That's the perfect.
Good. It took us a long time to plan this to get you loosened up, but the fact is that the perfect concert hall, which is what most people think of when they think of the interaction between music and architecture, is only the tiniest portion of that interrelationship over the history of music. Now, I suspect that my presentation this evening, and I looked very carefully at the very distinguished roster of people that preceded me, is probably going to be more historical than anybody else's. But it is out of necessity, because it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to understand where we are today in terms of music and space, unless we understand how this relationship has evolved. In essence, I should almost say, since the Greeks. Now, what this first slide has to do with. The most important thing to remember about music and space is that the vast majority of music on this planet has always been, and probably always will be, if you simply count it by majority rule, by the most people in the most places, has been and will be done out of doors. I've got 3 slides to open up here. This is what some of you may recognize as a Javanese gamelan. We hear gamelan concerts today if you happen to be a little bit on the eclectic side and watch the Daily Bruin and go to hear the ethnomusicology concerts a couple times a year, and they play indoors. But a gamelan was almost always in Indonesia, in Java, played out of doors. Likewise, we have here African drumming. Of course, in Africa, the drum is not conceived so much of as a musical instrument, which it also is, but as a means of communication, as a way of spreading messages over very, very long distances. So acoustics are terribly important in the way that these instruments have evolved and developed. You know, I think you can take the mic down just a little bit. Got a little ring off here. In the way these instruments have developed and evolved, but they've always adapted themselves to the out of doors. No one ever had to bring in any high-priced consultants to salvage an African drum. And finally, this is a spring festival in the mountains of Bolivia. It's important to remember that in non-Western cultures, and we very often, in spite of the fact that Los Angeles, of course, contains all the nations that participated in the 1984 Olympics, we very often forget that Beethoven is not at the center of the musical universe. But in fact, the peoples of the world who vastly outnumber those in the West do their music for the most part out of doors. And in fact, the notion of having space indoors to do music is an almost strictly Western one and a fairly recent one in the broad sweep of history. If you look, for example, here's a shot I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Acropolis and the Parthenon up there. Most Greek buildings were open in one way or another. Greek theater, of course, as most of you are familiar with, took place in semi-enclosed, at most very much open-air amphitheaters. The most that we know about the performance of any Greek music would have been associated with the Olympics, and one of the events was a performance on a double reed instrument, something of the predecessor of the oboe, but rather different in that it kind of hooked around the contestants, in this case, face. It was called the aulos, and it was an Olympic event. It took place, as did most Greek music making that we know anything about, out of doors. In fact, the notion of outdoor music persisted well into the 19th century. The Hollywood Bowl is anything but a fresh invention. It is, in a sense, a kind of recycling of an idea that's millennia old. This is an engraving from about 1598, end of the 16th century, which was the plan for a kind of open-air Colosseum arcade, as it were, that was being built for the Prince of Austria, who was entering in victory into the town of Antwerp. And the kind of outdoor music that might have been heard on such an occasion would have sounded like this. Of course, that piece couldn't have exactly been used for an entrance if it was a march. Could anyone tell me why? I want to see if you're all awake here. It has 3 beats to the bar. That's a famous piece called La Spagna, but it's arranged in this particular rendition very much in the kind of processional style that would have been known and would have been used as a kind of military procession. Now, little by little, of course, spaces became enclosed, and it's probably fair to say that the first spaces that were serious about being enclosed were churches. This happens to be, yeah, Phil, if you want to bring this up a little closer, it might work. This is pre-Restoration Sistine Chapel. The kind of space that was typical of Western music for about 1,500 years is a space, so this comes almost close to it, but it's a space in which the height exceeds the width. And if you think very hard about the buildings that you've ever been in or know about in which the height exceeds the width, they are almost always churches. And that has, of course, to do with a whole lot of things, among them the symbolism of reaching for heaven, of the kind of glory to God. Processionals, of course, took place to churches as well as entries into cities. This is the famous Basilica at San Marco in Venice. This is an engraving from about 1620, right in the middle of Claudio Monteverdi, the famous Italian composer's stay in Venice. You can see, and I think I have a pointer here. Let's see if this works. Yes, there's the Basilica up there. This was a kind of procession for the Doge, which was held annually, and which was accompanied by festive music that would last far longer than anything that would take place once you were inside the church. And of course, once in the Basilica of San Marco, you have, like, as in so many Italian churches, this sense of infinite space, in spite of the fact that San Marco is one of the smaller basilicas in Italy. And here is a bit of the Vespers of Claudio Monteverdi, the opening chorus, performed at San Marco. Opening with a bit of Gregorian chant, and then now the chorus. Now, even with this tape of a place that wasn't perfect to begin with and was being recycled through this room, in which, of course, the notion of acoustics is rather tortured by the time it reaches our ears, but you can at least get the notion that the first thing Westerners did when they brought music indoors was to change the acoustic. And that may seem rather obvious. If you do something indoors, it will sound different than it does out of doors. However, there's a whole movement in architecture in the 1940s which was responsible for most of the unhappy concert halls built since then, and we'll see a slide of one a little bit later, which is designed to bring the outdoor sound back indoors. But what they did in the West in terms of bringing sound indoors was not only to create structures with high vaulted ceilings and narrow passageways and long tunnel-like effects, was to put hard reflective surfaces in them. One of the things that I've always been most impressed by when I walk into an old church, as opposed to First Presbyterian in Westwood, for example, is everything is so massive and so hard. What musicians, of course, often talk about is reverberation time. I want a hall that's reverberant, like this wonderful space here. But even more important to a musician and to a listener as well, and what determines as much as anything for a musician, at least from my perspective being someone who does music, is how quick the sound is off the mark, how fast it's off. And there's nothing like 5,000 tons of marble to get sound going. And the fact that in this next slide, for example, this is a very, very famous church in Dresden where Heinrich Schütz worked for about 70 years. He tried to get out of it after 50, but the elector wouldn't let him go. And he died there an old, rather bitter man. But in this famous church, unfortunately, as you might imagine, destroyed by the Allies during the 1944 bombing blitz. But in this church, it was recorded in the mid-19th century that it had a reverberation time of almost 10 seconds. That is, every sound that was made lasted 10 seconds before it went to inaudibility from virtually any place in the church. Here is a bit of a wedding cantata that was performed in this church in Dresden. I love the sort of natural acoustics here, Phil. This is lovely. We'll just go with it. Freue dich, Rejoice, a wedding cantata by Heinrich Schütz, North German. That clearly is not the acoustic in which this piece was conceived for. It dies away very quickly there, as you can hear. In a moment, we'll hear a piece that comes closer to that. Now, how then could people hear and understand in spite of this tremendous reverberation? And the thing that most was remarked upon by visitors to this sanctuary was that in spite of the fact that the sound almost never died, I mean, you practically sat down on the pew and waited for an hour before it seemed to go away, every word was clear from the performers. Now, what's interesting is that the first scientific book about musical acoustics is written in the mid-19th century. There are a couple of sort of faltering starts in the late 18th century during the Enlightenment, but the first serious books in the first half of the 19th century. And we have to ask ourselves, how did they somehow conceive this perfect marriage between the music and the physical space? This is a very famous space also in Italy, which if any of you are fans of Antonio Vivaldi ought to be near and dear to you. This is the Ospedale in Venice, where a great deal of Vivaldi's music was performed. And if you can see that the musicians are in fact up to the left in this space, playing almost in a sense in kind of little compartments of their own, as it were. The separation, the notion of space in the first 2,000 years of acoustics almost always went up. If you walk away with one cliche tonight or one generalization that's a little bit different from ones you may have had earlier, it's the very fact that that space went up rather than out, which is the obsession among architects of the 20th century. And here's a little bit of a piece that may be familiar. Now, there are only about 15 or 20 people playing there. And nevertheless, in spaces like this, they were able to be heard, even though this is a rather large space capable of seating several hundred people. And one of the things that's most fascinating as one studies historically places in which Western music has evolved and taken place is that the crude correlation that we're likely to make between size and the reverberation time or the ease of hearing or the sense of intimacy and so forth, there's almost no correspondence. It seems that the architects somehow knew, regardless of the size space that they were creating, how to somehow get that correct balance. If any of you are interested in this particular subject, there is a wonderful article that I ran across this last month by a pair of, actually a father and son named Shankland, which you can find in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, about the acoustics at St. Peter's in Rome, in which they got permission from the Vatican to close the place down for several hours on several busy summer days to do acoustical tests. Now, if any of you have been in St. Peter's, you know that it's a vast, vast space, and one has the sense that the acoustics must vary tremendously. What they discovered is that regardless of where they stood, the decay time was almost exactly the same. Regardless of where they stood, the ability to hear, the sensation of hearing was exactly the same. Almost didn't matter where the sound originated from. Didn't matter whether you fired a blank pistol, a kind of quick start sound, or whether you played a violin tone, a more slow start and a more gradual decay. This absolutely astonishing acoustics that nobody has really been able to duplicate in the last 2,000 years is something that makes us kind of stop and ponder about the science of acoustics. This may be familiar to some of you only from a book, because again, this was a church that unfortunately was actually raised before the Second World War. It wasn't our fault this time. This is the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, that is the church of Johann Sebastian Bach for the 25 years that he worked there. And the interesting thing about this church is that it really is, and this is not just a visual kind of trick here, it was a very narrow, exceedingly high church, a very intimate kind of church, and we can well imagine the effect that works like this choral cantata, Cantata 78 by Bach, must have made. Now, Italian churches and German churches are different in the sense that this church, by all accounts, and of course they tend to be historical because the church was destroyed, but had a quicker decay, was not quite as sonorous as were most Italian cathedrals. And Bach's music, in fact, works best in a space that has a decay time of 5 or 6 seconds, rather than the 8, 9, or 10 seconds of many Italian churches. So there's a sense, again, of Bach's matching the sound, the kind of music, which is thicker, which is more homogeneous, and not quite so spectacular in its colors as Italian music at the time, with the trumpets and the violins and all that kind of mixtures. This is, again, a church in a north-central German town of Lüneburg. It's one of the few surviving Baroque churches, Baroque organs. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is it isn't just the space in which music took place or takes place, but it's the kind of instruments that do that music. And you're going to hear now one of the first recordings, if you're familiar with the E. Power Biggs recording of the Toccata in D, which was recorded in Symphony Hall in Boston, which is the one that most people have grown up with if you're over 30. There is a recording that you're going to hear. I want you to listen very carefully, because this is recorded in this particular chapel with this particular organ. And what you will hear is that the decay is such that in this piece, which is full of rests, and if you've ever listened to any of the Lon Chaney horror films, whatever, in which this piece is featured, it always dies away to nothing. But if you listen carefully here, you'll see that the acoustic, in fact, keeps the sound going until the next tones. And it doesn't really matter how long the performer waits in between. Notice the sound is still going. Now notice that actually what tells the performer when to come back in, that is when to stop the rest, to interrupt the rest, is exactly when the sound is naturally dying away. And it's an effect that's almost impossible to get if you're playing, as in so many American churches, a very dry church where the sound is like goes into a black hole and it leaves you hanging there, as it were. So the acoustic and the music here are simply intimately tied together. Now, of course, not all music making after certainly, let's say, 1550 or 1600 took place in churches, although one has to give the church the lion's share of credit for bringing music indoors, as it were. But it took place in spaces owned, not surprisingly, by rich people. Whoops, that's the wrong button. This is a very bad slide of a very famous painting. This hangs in the Dahlem Gallery in West Berlin, and in spite of my repeated entreaties to duplicate it and sell it, they've never done it, so this is the best I can do. This is Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the most talented eldest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, at Sanssouci in Potsdam, also history at this point after the war. But this is, again, a big vaulted room in which Frederick the Great is playing the flute. As many of you may know, he was not just a fine military general, but he was a flautist, and Carl Philipp playing keyboards. And virtually every evening when he was in residence, he had at least two musical sessions at which CPE was expected to preside. And here's a little snatch of a concerto for keyboard with very prominent flute parts, and it's not hard to figure out why the flute parts are so prominent. I'm going to take you through a couple of other intimate kinds of spaces in which early 18th century music would have taken place. Higher than either wide or deep. Notice the musicians don't sit like we do either. The gathering around the table was the most common way. Let me interrupt that for a moment. We are so concerned today, of course, with reaching our audience. But in the 18th century, music simply emanated, and because there were of the hard reflective surfaces, one wasn't concerned about which direction it went out in. Here are a couple of spaces. This is actually called the $1 Million Room, quite literally, in Schönbrunn out on the outskirts of Vienna, modeled obviously after Versailles. And here, again, a much larger hall, both spaces which would have been used for music. Now, how do they differ from spaces nowadays? Well, again, you see, again, the very, very high ceilings, the close width, and of course, what does that mean? That means in terms of direct sound and reflected sound, there is never very much time in between them, so that one has this sense of immediacy, regardless of how long the hall is. I had a remarkable experience about 15 years ago when I visited one of the few 18th century musical places that actually still exist, Esterhazy, that is where Joseph Haydn worked for about 25 years. And they still do concerts there. And I was sitting, I got in late, and there were tour buses crammed into the place, and I was about 150 feet back away from this teeny little dinky forte piano, and I could hear it perfectly. Simply because the sound just shot down off these hard wooden floors, these hard marble walls, these hard surfaces. You know, the biggest enemy of sound in the 20th century, I believe, has been plywood paneling. There was a time when people believed that there was a theory that went to justify the use of this cheap paneling, which was that when you put it on, it would vibrate and reinforce the bass tones. And of course, as they found out by bitter experience, it does just the opposite. It absorbs them beautifully. This is an early example of an opera house. Now you might say, gee, this makes the Met look kind of impoverished. But this is an opera house that was actually in Bayreuth, which is, of course, nowadays given over to Wagner. But at the time, it's important to remember that opera houses were in general, with the exception of two in Naples, they were built by royalty to glorify themselves. If you're familiar at all with many Baroque operas by Handel or other composers, the heroes are always these extraordinarily Superman, good one-dimensional, all-good characters who kind of reflect the nobility and glorify the nobility. And in these kinds of theaters, the sense again was to have these wonderful series of things to look at, the busyness, the kind of sense of being occupied, never being able to really get one's visual fill. This is a view from the stage, which gives you a good idea of kind of what the audience would have seen. And an example, again, of the kind of music that might have been played, I'm going to transpose you to France here for a moment, but this is the end of a late Baroque opera by Jean-Philippe Rameau, Castor and Pollux. Again, one of those things in which the two brothers fight over the same girl, and one ends up saying, "You take her." And that's a very short condensation of the plot, but... Now, the connection of music to space went far beyond what we see here, because space was used quite literally interacting with music in elaborate stage machinery. It would be an entire different presentation to talk about the kinds of machinery and the use of sending people across on ropes and cables and so forth. In this particular opera, for example, you just heard, there is a scene where a murder is about to take place, and out of nowhere comes God and tends to grab the hand of the person who's going to commit the murder. What they used to call a deus ex machina, God as a machine, quite literally. And this sense of coming across this wide stage, and it's hard to tell from this particular plan, although we'll see another one in a moment of La Scala, is that the depth of the stage generally at the time matched the depth of the house. So that you had a sense of this tremendous perspective, almost a kind of infinite reaching back, as if there was no back to the stage. Made for all kinds of interesting sounds. This is, in fact, a little dark, but you didn't need me to tell you that. This is La Scala in, of course, Milan, Italy. Another early opera house, and one of the things, there's so many more pictures here that are much clearer than this, but you can see the sense of height meant that the orchestra, what we call the orchestra section, was not much bigger than the group that is assembled here right now. And that people then simply went up the sides. And in many cases, the most desired seats were not down in the orchestra, the big buck tickets today, but in fact were up high. One felt that one had a much better vantage point. And if you read Mozart letters or you read Beethoven letters, you'll very often find people referring to boxes that were well above the stage. We're going to move to London now, because I want to use two cities, London and Vienna, to give you an idea of what prevailed in terms of the relationship between music and space in the 18th and much of the 19th century, and what we have so much lost today in Los Angeles. I mean, just as an example, before I go into this, I'll give you one quick one. There was a 2,800-seat concert hall called the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Now, as all you know, the Disney family has just given a huge amount of money to build another space for the Philharmonic. And guess what they're probably going to build? Another 2,800-seat concert hall that will probably look very much like the other one and have very much the same kinds of physical properties and so forth. The name of the game in Western music for centuries was variety, was choice, was a whole menu of acoustics that a given city would offer. Now, this is the gardens at Vauxhall. Now, Vauxhall had an elaborate English garden with this big enclosed space, but if you see, one of the sort of bits of genius about it is that if you look out the back, it looks infinite in this engraving, but it in fact goes literally out into the gardens, so that one entered and left. Now, concerts took place here weekly. It was a very, very popular place for doing music, and since the space is now destroyed, we can only imagine what the acoustics were like. but they must have been wild. I mean, they must have simply been all over the place. And yet again, because of the hard reflective material, there must have been a very quick kind of response and a kind of clarity that's very hard to get today. Now, in addition to places like Vauxhall Gardens, of course, there was Westminster Abbey. This is a picture of about 1771, and by now it had become customary to perform annually the following piece, which I'm sure, unless you've been in a cave for the last 30 years, you'll know.
There was with the angels a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God, glory to God in the highest.
I picked this example and glory to God quite consciously because, again, the sense of reaching up, of reaching for the heavens, which is, again, always the focus of this architecture, especially musically. Does anyone recognize this young man sitting right there? He's 10 years old, I can tell you that much, and the date is 1766. That's, of course, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And again, he is playing in a wealthy Italian emigre's music room, a gentleman named Prince Conti. And if you look at the space again, of course, and perspective has a way of exaggerating things. This, again, is a space that is destroyed now, which is why we have to use pictures so often. But the sense here is of a very open kind of space. Again, and there are some curtains there, but nothing, no throw rugs on the floor even. Again, sound goes right off the floor and fills the room. In spite of that you have two relatively soft instruments, an early forte piano and a guitar, and a woman there who is, I think, about to sing, either she or the dog or both. This is perhaps the most famous English concert room up to the middle of the 19th century, known as the Hanover Square Room. Now, reports are so remarkably varied. This room must have been like a chameleon. Most reports that you see say that it could have held up to 800 people. I think here there are probably only 500 or 600. When it had 800, apparently people stood. This is the space, and again, notice the height. This is the space in which virtually all of Haydn's symphonic works during the time that he had his 2 visits to London were premiered. Here is an example from a very famous piece by Haydn, Military Symphony, and a very famous passage in that symphony. Now, in spite of its fame, this hall was said to be only 60 feet deep, about 20 yards deep, a little over half of a football field. No, I guess much less than just the distance you get out from the goal line when they kick it in the end zone. And its acoustics were described again by people in diary entries, not in scientific terms, but as being immediate and real, and one having a sense of exactly being played to as the sound coming right to one. Unfortunately, when the English got the same mania that so many other people did, which was building mammoth halls, of which we'll see pictures in a moment, they tore the Hanover Square rooms down. These are ground plans of 4, I should say, well-known spaces in which Haydn performed in his lifetime. This is the room in Eisenstadt, and in fact, when I was there, the piano was here, and I was back here by the door where I heard so well. Here again is the small chamber room in Esterhazy, where Haydn rehearsed his orchestra, did most of his intimate chamber music making. Here is then the Hanover Square rooms, again of the measure about 60 feet here. and the King's Theatre in London. You can see that in his lifetime, then, Haydn had very different kinds of halls, very different kinds of spaces, and yet the music seems to have worked equally well in all of them. Now, you might be wondering, since I haven't showed you a secular space that could hold more than 800 or 900 people, when did the mania for big, huge, ostentatious group displays take hold? And when it took hold is during the first half of the 19th century, when this tradition of performing oratorios in the old Mormon tabernacle choir tradition took hold. That is, get as many people up on stage. In Vienna, how many of you have been to the Spanish riding school in Vienna, for example? Imagine an oratorio in that big, huge space where horses do their tricks with 800 performers, about 600 people in the chorus and 200 instrumentalists. This is the Crystal Palace, and which could hold, at the time, 800 or 900 performers on stage. Called crystal because the discovery of glass had meant now that a great deal of glass was in these spaces. It made them light. This is another part of the Crystal Palace. These are the places, by the way, that were used for almost all of the industrial expositions throughout the 19th century. Rather than our convention center, you had this. I think if you had a choice of going to one or the other, you'd probably go here. But the acoustics, again, in these places were described as being fiercely resonant, very immediate, a sense of realness about the music. And of course, during these expositions, there would be 200 and 300 piano makers assembled, all of whom would be showing customers their own instruments, sometimes only 40 or 50 feet apart. And it was said that you could hear perfectly the piano that you were listening to. You weren't bothered by the other ones unless you walked over and got into their sphere of hearing. This is another dark slide. This is our series of slides of the city of Vienna. You can recapture a little bit of this. I've chosen to use some contemporary engravings instead. I think that's not a good idea. You want to kill that again? Thank you. Yeah. What this tells us is that Vienna was built along the spatial models of an Italian city. Vienna was as southern as any city up to perhaps to Nuremberg in central Germany was, and this notion of the piazza or the place with buildings on all sides was terribly important because there was a very, very vibrant tradition. If you, in fact, were privy to the movie Amadeus, you'll be very, very familiar with this music, which would have been obviously composed for groups of outdoor instruments. It's hard for us to imagine today because the woodwinds are so well behaved, but virtually all of them grew up in the out of doors. This is a typical Viennese street. This is why Vienna handles air pollution very, very poorly. The streets are just like the interiors. That is, very narrow, very high, wonderfully reverberant, and in each of these houses live princely families. And these groups of serenaders, if you're at all familiar with the biography of Joseph Haydn, after he was thrown out of the St. Stephen's for his voice changing and presumably having cut the pigtail off of another fellow chorister, he earned his living for about 5 or 6 years by composing outdoor serenade music on the spot to be played on festive occasions or upon command or on commission. So the importance, if you remember Amadeus, this piece was played indoors, but it was very much of an outdoor piece. Listen a little bit more of it. And some more outdoor spaces. Notice again that it looks almost exactly like the Theater an der Wien. 5 layers of balconies, the very short orchestra section, and the almost square look. The biggest dimension, again, though, is in the height. And finally, I'm sorry, a black and white. We're going to hang me on this. It's around my foot. How's that? This is going to go over my head. That's it. How's that? Okay. Again, the very similar kind of look. Now, what's interesting is that 6 weeks out of the year, these theaters, and of course, what period was that? The period of Lent, before Easter, when operatic productions were forbidden. They were too licentious, perhaps, or whatever. But what was allowed during that time was orchestral concerts. So that most of Beethoven's music, for example, was premiered in rooms like this, in which you had not a whole lot of reverberation, so you had a more powerful kind of elemental sound produced, but in which the sense of immediacy was fantastic. Imagine in a space not much bigger than this, hearing for the first time a piece like this. Acoustic if you're only 30 or 40 feet away from those blaring trombones coming right at you. And there is the sense one gets in listening to a lot of music of Beethoven, which begins to be very different from that of Mozart, of him, in a sense, trying to get you to vibrate. I mean, he goes right after you. He goes literally inside of you in a way that Mozart's music never does. There's a kind of sense that some people get today of being assaulted by Beethoven's music, but I think it has as much to do with Beethoven's physical conception of space in these less resonant theaters. I've not said a whole lot about instruments. We don't have time to go into them very much, but looking at this violin, most of us would not be able to tell that it's very different in its sound and its makeup than a modern violin. This is Stradivarius, one that, Guarneri, one that was owned or at least loaned to Beethoven during his lifetime. One of the things that happened to violins, and it takes a very little to make a big difference in the sound, is that that neck, this portion up here, was lengthened slightly and raked over about 5 or 6 degrees, all of which raised substantially the amount of tension on this wooden bridge here. So that the new sound on the violin, which then these gut strings were replaced gradually by strings either with steel cores wound with gut or eventually with steel cores wound with gold or silver, to make a more brilliant, penetrating, but less sonorous sound at the same time. And of course, the development in the string family was paralleled by developments in the wind family. How many of you, for example, could get back your admission price by naming that instrument on the right? A basset horn, known very well to Mozart and used frequently by him. This is the clarinet family in the 18th century. Notice there ain't no keys. Benny Goodman would have had fun with these. There are only 2 or 3 keys on them. The sound that they produced was more intimate, but also rounder. I like to make an analogy to early instruments, not to which was louder, which is very often the kind of crude comparison made, but to the kind of sound. And to get the kind of sound picture of these in your mind, think of a new, freshly opened can of tennis balls with the fuzz still around the outside and very round and squishy. That's the kind of sound these instruments emitted. And of course, finally, the piano. This happens to be the piano by Konrad Graf, which was presented to Robert and Clara Schumann on the occasion of their wedding around 1839. However, How many of you recognize Beethoven's Tempest Sonata when played on an instrument somewhat earlier than this one, but very similar? I picked this one because I love the veneer. I'm sure if you like mahogany, you'll appreciate that as well. It's the finale of Beethoven's Tempest Sonata. Certainly less powerful than that of a modern instrument, but it is also a much quicker attack. Rather than the nice round piece of felt, very often with a half an inch or an inch of padded felt on the hammer core, these instruments were largely hard maple wooden cores with perhaps one layer of leather. In that sense, they were very much like percussion instruments, and yet they had, I think you would agree, a kind of haunting singing quality to them at the same time. The only thing that stayed the same throughout perhaps until the late 19th century was the monastery. This is the very well-known monastery. In fact, I was going to say at Melk, but I know it's not at Melk. I'll think of where it is in a moment. It's where Bruckner was born. Someone help me with Bruckner. Sankt Florian. Thank you very much. That's one of my graduate students. I'm just testing him. You can cut that again. You know, I kind of like it in the dark. And maybe I guess you're videoing. You'll probably want a little bit of light. But I haven't shown you many exteriors, but this beautiful space is, of course, a space in which Gregorian chant and Schubert masses and all kinds of a variety of musical styles coexisted for several centuries. And I really should have started at the very beginning of this by playing, really, in essence, the first Western music, or the first music heard by the masses, as it were. And that is a bit of Gregorian chant in the exterior of this magnificent church. The sense of breathing is covered beautifully by the acoustic. That is, the sound continues, so that one doesn't really notice people breathing. The purpose of Gregorian chant was to induce in the listener a state of almost hypnotic submission to the Almighty, as it were. It was a way of taming the beast in man, and this lovely resonant acoustic was something that contributed. Now, to make a rather crude apposition, we're going to go to one of the very first simple public music concert halls. This was not a theater, it was not an opera house, it was a rather small hall, but when the Paris Conservatory opened in the beginning of the 19th century, they said, we've got to have, thank you, we've got to have a space in which to do music. And it was in spaces like this, if you can imagine, that works like Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique were premiered. Before I play, I want to make the comment that in her memoirs, or in his memoirs, one of the things that Berlioz writes about Harriet Smithson, the Irish Shakespearean actress who was present on the occasion of this premiere, is that she was overwhelmed by the sound of so many musicians playing so loudly, so close. again, one was never more than 30 or 40 feet away, regardless of the fact that Berlioz had stashed almost 100 people up on stage. It was a sense of being so close. I doubt when we hear the Symphonie Fantastique at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, any of us are particularly overwhelmed. But imagine in this space hearing this work. Oh, there's a nice connection here. I can't resist pointing this out. We heard a bit of chant, and you're going to hear a bit of chant, of course, in Berlioz's last movement. It's the Dies Irae, the chant for the Mass of the Dead, which he makes rather supercilious fun of. Now, for the first time, then, we begin to have public places where concert music is performed. We take that so much for granted today. But the public concert hall was an oddity at this point. You could count the numbers of these in the first couple of decades of the 19th century on the fingers of one hand. One of the better known ones was the so-called Sing Academy in Berlin. And I want to show you a ground plan. If you can make out here, this is the horseshoe-shaped seating. And notice again that there are only about 14 rows, and that the stage is in fact almost deeper than the seating space. But we're beginning, concert halls are beginning to deepen. I'm going to take you through a couple of opera houses. This is again the La Scala in Milan. One of the things that you'll notice here, of course, is that the balconies now go all the way around in a kind of semicircle. This became a very popular way of building opera houses. And you can see here, I have to sort of move over here to pick it up. But the space in which this takes place is, again, rather a square. That is, we're moving away from this thin rectangular shape. As long as you didn't go over 40 or 50 feet, you could make it almost a square seating area. La Fenice in Venice. I had to do a double take for a moment because this is a 17th century production, although I'm going to play you an excerpt quickly from a premiere made in this very theater, that is of Verdi's Rigoletto in 1851. And also the site at which Stravinsky's A Rake's Progress was premiered in 1951. Now, while the tenor sings his aria, the Italians went back in their boxes and pulled the curtain. And they ate dinner and played cards and socialized. Still very much an issue here for Italians in their theaters, and it's one of the reasons that a theater like La Fenice, which still exists, by the way, if you go to Venice, it's a tragedy to miss it. It's about a 5-minute walk from Piazza San Marco. Is that this sense of intimacy is maintained. It's singer's music, and one has to feel in these houses as if the singer is singing right to you. That's one of the reasons that Verdi works less well at the Metropolitan than Wagner, for example. Now, what Wagner created, and this is, again, very typical of the kind of German attitude towards music in the latter part of the 19th century, is, we have one more. We have a French, I put this one in here. What about the boxes that the Italians have with the curtains that you pulled shut? The French don't even build them. Because if you're into being seen and to see and be seen and so forth, if you go to Dorothy Chandler to do those kinds of things, you would have preferred this kind of structure. This is the Salventa d'Or, where the Teatro Italien performed in the first half of the 19th century, and it has, again, an almost identical shape to La Fenice de la Scala, but with the open boxes all the way around. It seated about 200 more people as a result. And finally, as opera houses had to cave in ultimately to pressure to get bigger, even in spite of the visual distortion here. This is Covent Garden in London in the late 1840s. Notice that what's happening is the space is getting wider. This intimate, narrow space that has served music so well for so many centuries has given way to aisles that hold, horizontal aisles that hold 50 and 60 people across. Boy, this is prosaic, isn't it? This is Bayreuth in the 1950s. That is not a shoe factory in the background. That's the building that Wagner built. That is, of course, the Festspiel House in Bayreuth, where the Wagner operas take place. If you can think back to any of the physical exteriors that we've seen up till now, this was obviously not designed to look at from the outside. In fact, the shrine is very much on the inside. Here is an engraving again of the opening night at Bayreuth. And notice again what has happened. A fundamental kind of change made in the 1870s is that the balconies have virtually disappeared. There's a little bit of seating up there, but there are far fewer of them, far fewer seats, and the crowd has come down into the orchestra. Now, I think one of the reasons that Wagner built his space that way, and he was one of the first to do this, is because he wrote these operas for you to come and worship at. And you want your congregation like I've got you, all right down in front of you. You can pass the offering plate easier. You can have a sense of control over them much more, rather than dispersing them and letting them go up into the heavens, as it were. So Wagner built what was, in essence, is a kind of secular church in which the space was designed to facilitate this devotional sense. I'm going to put a bit of Tristan on in a moment, so you'll get a little bit of the period feel. But one of the things that you'll also notice, if you paid any attention to the previous slides, where was the orchestra? The orchestra was simply right out among the crowd. Again, part of that sense of immediacy. But not only did Wagner create music that was too damn loud to be out there with the crowd, otherwise you'd never hear anybody, but he wanted this sense of remoteness. He wanted to create a sense of yearning, of longing for that orchestra. So what you see here, you get a much better picture of in the next slide. This is a photograph actually from down in the orchestra pit. You don't want to back off. Here it would only be perhaps a 2 or 3 week stay in the hospital. There it would be fatal if you backed off the stage down into the pit. The musicians play and never see anything that goes on stage. Now, how then did, at that time, the conductor possibly have any contact? Before they had any kind of video monitors, which they used, by the way, nowadays at Bayreuth. There were very often a series of relay people who would look from the from the conductor, kind of prompters, boxes, and so forth, a very elaborate setup designed to keep the singers in some kind of touch with the orchestra. And you can get an even better sense of this by looking at the way it's designed. There is the orchestra pit, one of the biggest spaces in the house, and here is, again, the kind of rising orchestra area. This slope, by the way, this gradual upward slope, which had not been part of any physical space for music before the 1820s and 30s, was made into a kind of institution at the Festspiel House and is part of virtually any musical space today. We have to hear a bit of Tristan to distinguish it from the Italian intimacy. This is not intimate music. Second act, love duet. contact that the audience had with the singers and vice versa was very different from that of an Italian opera house, which is one of the reasons the Italians didn't mount Wagner operas, not because they didn't necessarily acknowledge the greatness of Wagner, but because the spaces in which they perform music simply didn't allow that kind of transplant. This is a very important slide because it does inaugurate what becomes ultimately now the age of the concert hall. And we're almost exactly about a century into that, a little bit over a century. This is one of the inside of one of the first big concert halls designed in Europe. It's the Musikvereinssaal, the so-called Goldener Saal, the Golden Hall in Vienna. Notice again that this is the back of the hall. That the front of it, where the orchestra plays down here, there is no back here. And in fact, it just goes out into a lobby area. Any acoustician today would tell you this is a disastrous prescription. And yet, by common consent, this is one of the great opera halls of Europe. Why did people begin building concert halls? Well, economics had now come in to the point where it began to take over. I think it's fair to say that the design of most halls today is governed about 85 or 90% by the economics. That is, you have to make a hall big enough to break even. In this time, you went from halls that seated 700 or 800 people to those that seated 1,500 or 1,600 people. And if you could charge the same amount for the ticket but cram twice as many people in, obviously you could put on more concerts. And I think this is a bottom line town. I don't have to explain this to you. This is a photograph, pretty much unchanged, of the hall. And you can see we're looking from the other end now. Those are the open marble columns at the end. And here you are at the stage. Now, this picture is particularly revealing because it inaugurates what many people, I'm not the first certainly, call the shoebox concert hall. It was the style that predominated from about 1870 to about 1940. And there are very, very, very few of them left. In fact, there are really only two left. One being this Musikvereinssaal in Vienna, and the other being the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, which we'll get to in a moment. This is a very telling pair of slides. This is the first one. This is from about 1780. This is the old Gewandhaus in Leipzig in North Germany. Notice again its characteristics, the tall, thin space, the seating for perhaps 400 or 500 people. The Gewandhaus means, by the way, linen house. It was, or tapestry house, or cloth house. It was where the clothiers' union, the cloth manufacturing guild, had its headquarters, and eventually it was made into a music space. Leipzig was a very, very progressive space in the 1780s. They didn't build a concert hall, but they at least had one that they adapted. Now, on this very same space was built exactly a century later a shoebox, 3 times as big. And you'll notice, of course, the similarities. You'll see the rectangular shoebox shape and the similarities with the Goldener Saal, the Musikvereinssaal in Vienna. Still, however, one has to say that there is a far greater sense of intimacy, of closeness in these halls than there is, for example, in Avery Fisher Hall or any of our modern halls. Now, it was in these kinds of buildings that pieces like this were either premiered or performed. Chose this most ambitious work by Gustav Mahler. This is the pocket score, by the way, to Mahler's 8th Symphony. Actually, this is a first edition of the orchestral score, and one of the messages it makes or gives to us is that space had many, many manifestations in the 19th century. This was the largest score, not just in the number of instruments, but in the physical dimensions that Universal Edition had ever and was ever to publish. It's not till you get into the 1960s when you get some of these huge, 3- and 4-story scores with hundreds and hundreds of instruments. But the notion again, however, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that Beethoven's symphonies, his overtures, his operas were premiered and performed in halls in which he taxed them to the maximum. That is, you couldn't stand one more decibel of sound in Leonore No. 3 in that size hall. Mahler then did the exact same thing for places like the Gewandhaus in Leipzig, the Goldene Saal in Vienna. You can see here again, this is a plan for the Konzertgebäude. Notice the shoebox shape. Oh, still the other. Again, the rectangular shoebox. The outside of the Konzertgebäude in Amsterdam, and the inside. Notice that we've got a balcony on the side, but again, the orchestra section has become greatly expanded. Now, what Mahler did is he wrote pieces that would exactly tax to the maximum the absorbent abilities of these halls that seated 16, 17, 1,800 people. To go to 3,000, which is what we've done basically today, was beyond even Mahler's wildest dreams, that there would have been those kinds of spaces. So even though the cliche often is heard, well, we have big halls today to accommodate Mahler symphonies, our halls today are still twice the size in terms of seating capacity, if not volume, of these earlier halls. Whoops, there goes this mic. Just to recapitulate the shoebox plan, I mean, you can see it. All of these are the spaces, physical spaces for all of them. Now, the reason they kept this shoebox style, and can anyone, by the way, think of a very famous American concert hall, the only American concert hall ever to really be built on this shoebox pattern? And I think one of the most marvelous halls in America. I don't know if it's next here, but it should be. No, it's not next. I'll explain that in a moment. Symphony Hall in Boston, built in the early years of the 20th century, is your square, your rectangular shoebox. Why am I showing you a picture of the Opera, the opera house in Paris, burning down? Maybe it's 80% through the lecture and I'm trying to wake you up again, but it's to make a very simple point. The age, the longevity of the average space for music performance throughout the 19th century, because of fire, war, famine, pestilence, plague, everything else, was about 14 years. So that these structures would get put up, and one of the reasons they're not around so much anymore is because they burned down. Some careless smoker or something. I'm not quite sure how this one got started. But it's a rather graphic painting, done only a couple of weeks after the actual event, and the whole thing just burned to the ground. If you don't know this space, then you ought to at least know the line that goes to it. How do you get to Carnegie Hall, right? Practice, practice, practice. This is perhaps the most famous space in America, and yet, curiously, what just happened to Carnegie Hall? They spent millions of dollars changing its acoustic. Carnegie Hall, if you look here, is one of the first halls that's wider than it is deep. And for that reason, it had very dispersed acoustics, a very large amount, relatively speaking, of delay time between the immediate sound and the reflected sound. And that's one of the things that acousticians have learned is crucial to the listener's sense of immediacy, of being right there to hear the music. And what they've done in the new Carnegie Hall is to try and make the reflective surfaces more apparent, to take more of the cloth out of it, to get the reverberancy back in. They even did a mild amount of sort of fudging of the shape to take a little bit of the width away from it. Carnegie Hall, as wonderful a space it has been historically, is not, acoustically speaking, one of the world's great concert halls. This is the Royal Festival House in London. Again, a sense one gets of these weird kinds of newer halls that combine the balconied look with the large orchestra sections. What you have now are 40 and 50 rows of orchestra. This is one of the most famous comparisons in all of modern acoustics, and I began my talk by mentioning the case of Leo Baranek, the celebrated acoustician who had the unhappy job of designing the new Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center. what he designed actually ended up being here on the left. Now, the story goes that these bulges out here were added by, and again, this is the influence of economics on musical space, 225 seats added by the managing company of the new hall in order to get that many more patrons. Someone figured out that unless you had those seats in there, you weren't going to break even, or you were going to lose more money than you wanted to. What you have on the right is what it took 12 years and about 50 different acoustical experiments to turn into Avery Fisher Hall. And of course, what they essentially did in Avery Fisher Hall was to try to make it as much as possible the rectangular shoebox that we had in the earlier concert halls of about a century before. It's the age of hi-fi, and I'm going to show you a couple of electronic things in just a moment. If you've been to Berlin, you can't have missed this. Even if you didn't like music, you would have asked as you drove by, what the hell is that? That is the Philharmonie in Berlin, built around 1960, and I think one of the most stunning musical structures in the 20th century. If you're going to build, and the point I made earlier about the variety of musical spaces that you had in Vienna, the different kinds of acoustical environments, the outdoors environment, the indoor environment, the intimate chamber music room, and so forth, what we've come to now are a series of multi-purpose, one-dimensional, one characteristic concert halls. Now, the charge here in Berlin was also to build a 2,000 or 2,300 seat concert hall. But the builders decided to do it their own way, as you might say. And this is the foyer. The sense one gets is of sweep and space. What I love most about this building, when I first went into it, went to my first concert, and you can only see it very dimly on this rather overexposed slide, is the railings all around this whole space are those that we use in American elementary schools. You know, the classic round railing, the cheap round metal railing. This is a very inexpensive hall. It's built with inexpensive materials. I mean, it's acoustically sensational, but it is not your glitzy kind of hall, and it has a kind of lean, sleek look that one associates with a lot of contemporary architecture in Berlin especially. What this hall tried to do is solve the dilemma of seating huge amounts of people, over 2,000 people, but having them all close to the orchestra. So you have a kind of almost circular kind of seating. You have some seats up here in the back, actually behind the orchestra, which they do fill most of the time. But by compromising between the depth and the height, you actually get nobody further than about 60 feet, 65 feet away from the space. So it's a very, and it's, of course, geometrically, if you're into geometry as an architect at all, there is not one right angle in the thing. It is an unequal geometric pattern. And for that reason, one never tires visually sitting in it. You're always exploring new kinds of angles to it. This may look familiar. An architect named Watson had the idea in the 1920s and 30s to bring the outdoor acoustic indoors, which was the worst idea, and this is from a musician's point of view, anyone could have ever come up with. So what he designed was, you know, you ever sat underneath the first balcony at Dorothy Chandler? This happens to be the Purdue Music Hall in Lafayette, Indiana, built in 1940. But this has been replicated all over the United States. There are hundreds of these halls, unfortunately. And one bombing run won't remove, I'm afraid, all of them. But when you sit under, as you can at the Dorothy Chandler, and feel like, you know, you're listening from Pasadena to the concert, these are halls in which width, that is, you keep your rectangular shape, but you simply add this huge amount of width to it so that the reflected sound time is hopeless, and you have all kinds of, with these deep, deep balconies to allow for the founder's circle, you have these hopeless areas, 15 and 20 rows deep, where nothing seems to get to you, and you have to cope with them. Or you can get really wacko. This is a hall in Portland, Oregon, believe it or not. And it kind of looks like straw weaving up on top, doesn't it? But, you know, this is, I think, the only way one can approach acoustics and musical space today, which is to do experiments with sound, to build things that really don't fit the normal pattern at all. There's a severe rake in the orchestra, you'll notice, to recapture some of the sense of height. The balconies are also much more severely raked. Notice that the old 18th century balconies were always flat kinds of spaces. But the sense that everybody gets here is of being uplifted, of constantly going up. and yet you can get a lot of people in the space. So you can get something like 2,000 people in here, whereas the same physical space in Vienna would have only seated about 800 or 900. This is a wonderful engraving, actually, from the early 20th century, which I've always loved because it is an early, 1912. It says, Fonografia. This is a sala de fonografia, in which people went for the first time to listen to records. It wasn't exactly Sam Goody's or Tower Records, but people actually went and began for the first time in the history of any music to totally redefine musical space. If you think about the revolution that electronics has brought about, it is not simply the fact that we have, as I'll talk about in a moment, synthesizers and synclaviers and Casios and Yamaha DX7s and so forth. It's the fact that acoustical spaces are now portable. And even though I'm sure the sound here was not one that any of us would actually want to take home with us, there was nevertheless this tremendous breakthrough with the first wax cylinders and ultimately the Edison electrical cylinders and so forth. Now, this is, of course, the famous Le Corbusier music pavilion at the Brussels World Fair in 1958. Le Corbusier designed this space after hearing some of this music. There's a detail of Le Corbusier. This sounds to me today, this music is now, think about it, 30 years old, composed with simple oscillators, very simple filters, hand spliced together with thousands of splices, the kind of things that we, any little $50 Casio will now do. We're way beyond the technical means of Edgar Varèse, the French engineer, later immigrant American composer. But what he was, of course, trying to do, among other things here, and has happened at many world fairs since then, is to redefine musical space. This kind of building is precisely a reaction away from the one-dimensional, all-purpose concert hall, where music has taken place and become a kind of middle-class institution, just like going to church or synagogue on the weekend. So the sense here of a building that defies normal notions of scale, in which the seating, I'm sorry I don't have an interior shot, but what Varèse wanted people to do was to listen to this music as they walked through the space. And it was designed so that the acoustic changed every place that you went, so that you had a kind of multi-dimensional sound journey through this space. An even more radical example, actually, was one designed for the 1970 World's Fair in Osaka, Japan, by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the North German experimentalist composer. This actually was a kind of hemispheric ball that was enclosed, and over here was a kind of open hemispheric, a kind of web shape, in which people then could listen to music off of 49 different loudspeakers. Now, what composers like Stockhausen and Varèse have done for us, whether we have wanted them to do it or not, is forced us to think about what musical space is going to mean for us. For example, the one thing that comes to me almost immediately as a musician when I think of these multi-purpose concert halls in which I play all the time, in which I go to listen to concerts in, is museum. They're auditory museums. They're wonderful museums, but they are very carefully, they have a fine curatorial staff, and we preserve them and so forth. But they aren't places, in a sense, the way the Leipzig Gewandhaus, the new Leipzig Gewandhaus, was when a Mahler symphony was played there for the first time. And so it has fallen, in a sense, to special events like the Osaka World's Fair. Was anyone here, aside from myself, at the outdoor Stockhausen performance at the Olympic Arts Festival in 1984? You see, these aren't mass media events somehow. But there were a lot of people there. Actually, it was down at Barnhill Park, and it was absolutely incredible. But again, a piece designed by Stockhausen to be performed out of doors. I want to leave you with a little bit. Unfortunately, the piece that Stockhausen composed for Osaka, Japan is not recorded. But here's a bit from, I think, the first electronic music masterpiece called Der Gesang der Jünglinge, the Song of the Youth, which is a kind of requiem, I think, for victims of the Holocaust. It's from the book of Daniel, where Daniel is thrown to the lions, and the lions, of course, don't eat him. And analogies to the ovens and so forth, I think, are rather graphic. These are pure electronic sounds. No electronic composer, no Mort Subotnick, none of the very gifted people working today use these really old sounds now, but they have a certain quaintness about them today. And of course, the mixture of the young male voice singing the Gregorian chant and then cut up and manipulated by Stockhausen. Designed just like the Osaka production, this is the only authentic piece you heard tonight. Because you're hearing this piece exactly as Stockhausen intended you to hear it, through loudspeakers. We should have 4, Phil, but we'll have to do it soon. Sense, I think. This is a piece that lasts exactly 13 minutes to the second, and in which the cutting up, literally with scissors and splicing tape, that Stockhausen does of this young boy's voice is, I think, so symbolic of the kind of manipulation that was done of millions of people during the war. A piece that was finished in 1955, by the way, by Stockhausen. Now, the question that comes then for you budding architects, and for those of you who are fans of architecture, is what is your relationship to musical space? If you have perhaps a slightly deeper view of the historical relationship between music and space, what is the responsibility of an architect today? I think it's a couple of things. First of all, it's to ensure variety. There are 2 buildings in this city, I won't tell you where they are, where I can perform old music on a forte piano and make it really work. They're accidental, by the way. No one designed them. One's a Jewish temple and the other's a Presbyterian church. But we have so many all-purpose halls in this town that we could, almost give one away to each citizen and have enough to go around. What we need to do is to begin building different kinds of spaces so that there is a kind of plurality, the kind of choice that would have existed in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I would like to say, by the way, it isn't just so we can play old music and do Vivaldi and Schutz and Bach and all this, because of course, if you look at your record bins recently, they are filling up with Christopher Hogwood and Trevor Pinnock and those people. But for the performance of contemporary music as well. If you talk to any living composer, and there are a few after all, aside from the pop music type, you will find that one of their biggest laments is they have no spaces in which to perform their music. One of the things that I said to Phil when I walked in here is I said, we could do some concerts here. And the first thing I thought about was not forte piano music, but 20th century music. Because you have this slightly funky kind of open space here, which is so different from the normal acoustic around town. And the other thing is we need some people with some courage to build spaces that are ultimately dependent not on bottom line economics, but on a vision, on a plan. I don't know what the acoustics of the 21st century are going to be, but I do know that as they are increasingly bottom line economically based decisions, that we have become increasingly homogenized, so that even the 500-seat halls are little versions of the 2,000-seat halls with the similar acoustical properties and so forth. So we simply need to open the whole space up. And Phil, I know I've run over. At this point, could you maybe turn the lights up everywhere? Oh, I have two last slides, actually. It's a partial answer to it's an example, I think, of the kind of courage, in this case, shown by the French government, not by a wealthy person or by a corporation that has to pay its shareholders. But this is the performing space at IRCAM in Paris. And you'll notice that what it is, and I've spoken to Mr. Boulez about this, who had some input into its design, it is an infinitely adjustable acoustical space. All of this gridwork up here can have baffles of any kind hung from it to totally tune the room to the kind of music that's being done, acoustical music, electronic music, what have you. It's also designed to look like a laboratory. It's an experimental space, and in spite of the fact that they have public concerts here all the time, they wanted to build a space that did not say, put your black tie on, get in the rolls, get chauffeured down to the hall, and let the valet parking take care of it, and sit down and don't move for 2.5 hours. The idea was to create a space that invited people to join the experiment. And the very last slide here is simply a cutaway of the whole broad plan of IRCAM. This is the experimental space you looked at. And what they've done is to create a whole bunch of small, some above ground, some underground laboratories in which various kinds of acoustical conditions prevail, so that it is truly possible for a composer to find his acoustic. Mozart, we have to remember, was at home in the only kinds of acoustic that were available to him. But today, given the plurality, the way the world is, we need many, many more of these kinds of spaces. Sadly, there is not yet anything like this in the United States, and I look forward to the day when perhaps somebody from SCI-Arc, Phil, will be the architect for the first one. You've been very patient. I'd be happy if you're still awake and have any energy left, I certainly do, to field some questions, some things that I've left out, some things you hoped I would talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Before Dr. Winter does answer any questions, I'd like to invite everybody to a reception featuring the recent works of one of SCI-Arc's faculty members, Roland Coate. This reception will be in the Graduate Annex building, which is 2 buildings that way.
And if you haven't
Just
seen
follow
it, you
the
don't
crowd.
want to miss it.
It's a very nice exhibit, Roland's recent works. Now, Dr. Winter will answer some questions, and please wait for the microphone to come to you so that everybody can hear your question. Thank you. Anybody have a question?
Have you given any thought or consideration about stadiums and music?
Outdoor stadiums.
Stadiums, right.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, people like Stockhausen have. In fact, they've created works for large 60 and 70,000 seat stadia. I think that's the kind of attitude that we have to have about music today. In other words, we have to, if we don't take it out of the homogenized middle-class concert hall, it's not going to survive. Certainly art, concert music, and rock and roll for that matter. If you look for acoustical variety, you have it most nowadays where? In rock and roll. The most sophisticated acousticians in town, musically speaking here, are the sound reinforcement people. They're my heroes. And they can go into the Greek Theater, they can go to the Amphitheater, they can go to the Rose Bowl, they can go any place and make the sound work and create a kind of effect. They can tune to the acoustical space. We need to do a whole lot more of that. And we need to encourage people to take that kind of leap. How many of you would go to a concert if you saw it advertised at the Rose Bowl? I mean, that's one of the problems, is, the hands don't go shooting up. I'll go watch the Bruins play, but I really don't want to, or the pep band play, but I don't want to go to hear a concert there. Yes, right here.
You talk a lot about the physical space, and the relationship to historical evolution, how the music was heard and understood. Is there any relationship between the space that actually music creates and the space where it's supposed to be performed?
Could you just elaborate slightly for me on what you mean by the space that music creates?
Well, I'm not a musician, but
I'm not an architect.
So, but when I hear a piece of music, it seems to me that there are moments that either a sound is either interrupted, and it's not interrupted just by pure coincidence, but maybe it's by design, and that there is another sound that it follows that one, that it creates either a vacuum or it creates I call it a space. I don't know if it's right or wrong.
Do you mean like a rest of silence among other
perhaps,
things?
yes.
Aha, yes.
And now, in a composer's mind, is there any relationship between that and what is supposed to be the envelope?
Absolutely, a fundamental, I mean, the question I think I restated, I hope I don't butcher it for you. What is the connection between music and the interaction that the space that the music, coming out of the instruments creates with the musical space in which that music takes place, especially as it might relate to rest, to silences. If you remember the Bach example I played, there was a fundamental connection there. Bach has big rests on the music, but the sound reverberates through the hall. If you take, for example, The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, and were to play those wonderful play those in such a church, it would totally ruin the effect. Every single this is much too loud for that music. That music is written for a dead hall. I mean, it's written for a place like Avery Fisher or Symphony Hall in Boston or what have you, because the sound has to disappear right away. Now the question is then, given the fact that, I mean, and in a very, very crude sense, music has gone from being composed for very reverberant spaces in which the interaction required a lot of resonance to much drier halls in which a lot of electronic music, in which a lot of acoustical music of the, let's say, post-war period has been designed for. What do you do about a museum orchestra, which they are, who is trying to play music by all of these people? I mean, how do you possibly do an acoustic? I mean, for example, the biggest fiasco I remember on silences was when they borrowed our forte piano at UCLA and took it to Dorothy Chandler Pavilion for my good friend Malcolm Bilson to play with the LA Philharmonic, because forte piano is a big deal now, and you got to do it. Well, they had a rehearsal, I mean, and from the fourth row you couldn't hear it. And you couldn't even hear it on stage. It was just, not because the place was big, not because it had 3,000 seats or the cubic footage, but because it has all those cloth seats and all that carpeting and all that absorbent material. So they ended up putting 3 microphones inside this silly little piano. It sounded kind of like Charlie Brown's little piano at the concerts. So, I mean, there is an intimate connection, and it's one of the reasons that modern composers are very frustrated. They don't like the homogenized, plain, low reverberation time of the modern concert hall. They want to write music for different acoustical conditions, for outdoor auditoriums, for outdoor theaters, for amphitheaters, and so forth. But they can't do it. We do it in reverse, in fact. We take the outdoor theater and play Brahms at the Bowl. And that drives them crazy. So, I mean, if a hall is being built, and any of you ever have anything to do with building a musical space, don't talk to the conductors, because they played Brahms and Beethoven and Bach. Talk to the composers who are alive, because those spaces are going to be around for them a lot longer. And I'm not here, by the way, as a sort of knee-jerk defender of all contemporary music. There's a whole lot of garbage, just like there was in Beethoven's time. But I am defending the notion that we have to at least plan spaces that are going to speak somehow to people who are going to live after us. Phil?
Can you speak a little bit more about this transition from music being played for the masses, like in the first couple slides you showed, into this very kind of elitist situation today where architecture students can't really afford to go listen to good music?
Yeah.
So we invite people to come and play it for us.
Well, I won't get into a political statement here, but around 1825 is a huge year in the history of music, Phil, because in that year, Johann Strauss Sr. started a dance band. Now, what's significant about that is for the first time, now Mozart wrote dance music, and Haydn wrote dance music before Johann Strauss Sr. in 1825. But what happened in 1825 is Strauss did nothing but dance music. He started pop music, as it were. And then you get his son, Johann Strauss Jr., and you get, beautiful blue. The difference between the time of Brahms and Strauss and the time of Mozart is that Mozart wrote both kinds, did both. In Strauss's day, Brahms wrote mostly symphonies, and Strauss wrote, of course, pop music. Now, there's a connection still there because they used the same orchestra. Now today, I mean, you're not going to, the Grateful Dead or, the Dead Kennedys or the whatever, they're not going to sound up like the LA Philharmonic. But at that time, what happened is tickets got cheaper. I mean, for a whole long time until they got cheaper. Because if you look at up to 1800, 5% of the population heard music. After that, everybody who was coming into this new middle class, this is very, very quick cultural history, friends, but basically, all of these people, suddenly, they wanted the trappings, at the very least, that the aristocrats had. So that brought about, I should have said, part of these big concert halls. The middle class wanted to come. They wanted something to do on Saturday night. They wanted some sense. Now, ticket prices went way down. And in fact, governments got smart and they subsidized them. It was good for cultural image. It was, good for all kinds of things. Now, what's happened in a town like Los Angeles, unfortunately, is that bottom line has just sort of pressed and pressed. The truth is, you can't, even with 3,000 or 6,000 seats at the Chandler Pavilion, support what it costs to run that orchestra. And therefore, that's why architecture students get priced out, although you know about $5 student rush, I hope. What does it cost for the LA Philharmonic to play in that museum? A single service, this is not counting rehearsals, runs $60,000. Plus Isaac Stern's $15,000. I mean, you're just in the, and if you sell all 3,000 seats at $20 an average, you haven't even broken even yet, much less paid the house crew, paid the overhead, paid the mortgage and the amortization and everything else. So we have to find different ways, which was one of the reasons why many universities are the place where interesting experiments go on. There's a place here in Santa Monica called The House. Anyone ever, Marcia, I've seen that, there's been to The House. I mean, it's a place that wasn't really designed for music, but it's a wonderful place in which a lot of the contemporary music in the West Side takes place. There's no place else to do it.
Where is that?
Marcia, I'd have to get the exact address. It's on 8th or 9th Street? Yeah. No, it's actually, it is still used, although it's not as active as it was 3 years ago. You're right about it. But there are new spaces. People do them in lofts now. The big scene is downtown in lofts. Composers like the live acoustics, and they like the intimacy, and they like the cheapness. We forget that when Mozart did concerts, he paid everything. It was a capitalist venture. He paid the musicians, he paid for the food for the rehearsal, he copied the music, he wrote the music, he did everything. Nowadays, you've got this incredible amount of overhead because, everybody's on the payroll and nobody is kind of into an entrepreneurial kind of attitude about it. So the ticket prices go up and up. It is, I always order tickets when I talk down there and give them away to students. I mean, see me, Phil, afterwards. We'll give you some. Yes, in the back there. No, but I know about him, and I'm very glad you brought it up, only to say that, were you here for the very first comments I made? Good, you didn't miss much, but what I did say was that for 90% of the world, the notion of a Western concert hall, which is what most Westerners think of as being what acoustics is all about, is irrelevant, because most music is non-Western, and it takes place in incredible places. I mean, I don't know if the Taj Mahal is a place where a bunch of music making goes on anymore. But the point is that we need to really broaden our acoustical horizons. And after all, the pyramids and the Taj Mahal were here far before Symphony Hall in Boston or Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was here. I think what's going to happen, my sense is that's what's going to happen, is that the world is shrinking and that nobody anymore is a Western composer. You can be, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant born in the middle of Ohio, and by the time you're 25, you've been exposed to more kinds of things and perhaps been to visit the Taj Mahal than people of 2 or 3 generations before. So I sense that given the great portability of electronic media, given the curiosity that people have about the rest of the world, that we're going to probably get our acoustical variety back that way. Not by, I'm afraid, concert managers and symphony hall managers offering it to us. I think we're going to have to take it that way.
surprised when, most people purchase the album and so forth, they hear it,
Well, there are whole pockets of the music business. The other night we had the good fortune to hear the jazz pianist, Oscar Peterson, thank you. Name slipped me away. And the place was packed. But there are jazz enclaves all over Los Angeles. Now, the acoustics in these jazz places are very interesting. The spaces that are designed are very interesting. They're not all just sort of, reclaimed shoe stores in which someone's put a piano up on the stage. They're very, very interesting spaces. There are very interesting things. I don't know if any of you have ever had the privilege of going to Betty Freeman's house in Beverly Hills, where there is contemporary music programs 3-4 times a year, sometimes 5-6 times a year. I mean, there are things going on, but you're right. The albums are bought by the people who are at the concert, not as a result of some big marketing campaign that Warner Brothers put on. And because of that, the diversity of musical spaces hasn't reached the mass audience that I hope it will in the next 10 or 15 years. But architects are going to have a lot to do with that. They need to have their own kind of musical conscience as well. Sure.
What was the name of the Portland Hall?
I could find out for you, but I don't remember. Not Weird Hall, but wonderful place. Yes. Yes. Well, you see, I'm glad you brought it up. I tried to speak to it, but I'll speak to it again because it always needs clarification. We have this jaded notion that the longer the reverberation, the less clear it is. But that simply isn't true. The longer the reverberation, the longer the reverberation. I've been in some very low reverberance halls in America. Some of the WPA halls built during the Depression, for example. There's a fabulous one in Kansas City, Missouri, which somebody should firebomb, but it's still there. But I mean, in which there's no reverberation, and it's the unclearest hall in the world. You can't understand anything anybody says 10 feet away from you. So you can have great clarity with great reverberance. I mean, that's the magic of acoustics. It has a lot to do with the geometric shape and with the reflective surfaces. The harder the surface, you have a lot more clarity right away. One of the things you lose when you put a lot of absorbent material is you lose your clarity because it gets absorbed before people have a chance to hear it. In other words, the ratio of reflected sound to immediate sound goes in an inverse direction when you have these low reverberant halls, and you don't really get the kind of clarity you would hope for. Acoustics is nowadays, there are books. I checked out this last couple of months just out of kind of idle interest, the half-dozen leading textbooks on acoustics in space. There is some science to it, not nearly as much as the acousticians would still tell you. And you have to ask yourself how this rather perfect marriage prevailed for so many years. In other words, you don't start getting bad concert halls until the 20th century. There aren't halls people complained about until Carnegie Hall. And Carnegie Hall was one of the first halls to benefit from acoustical consulting. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Walter. Well, this is one of our fine UCLA graduate students. The notion that you go to a concert to sit still was invented by the middle class. Who thought somehow that to be aristocratic, it required going and behaving oneself. And it was a test to go to a concert and sit quietly for 2 hours. No aristocrat had ever done that. Opera houses up until the late 19th century, as you well know, they had curtains, you closed the front, and you played Parcheesi or whatever you wanted to play until your favorite thing came, and then you listened, and you went back to the opera 5 times that week, and you eventually heard all of it, but you consumed it in much different ways. I think the much more historical kind of listening experience is that which we have in a car radio. That's the closest. You listen sometimes. When somebody pulls in front of you, you don't listen, or you hopefully don't listen for a couple seconds, and you switch back in and out. I tell people all the time, when I go to a concert, I listen to half the concert. The other half the time, I'm looking at the hall. I'm thinking about, and that's, I believe, the way music was designed for the most part to be experienced. Certainly the way Mozart felt people would experience it.
I assume that the number of people
Yes, it does. That's interesting you bring that up, because like airplanes, they're supposed to break even at 60% payload. There are a number of halls that are actually designed with a non-full house in mind. With 80%, for example, as being a kind of, realistic figure. And the reverberation, the materials that are picked on the basis of 80% capacity. The number of seats, however, in any hall I've ever had anything to do with or have learned anything about, the number of seats was a decision that had no acoustical input, no musical input whatsoever. You are told by a management company, this is what you've got to do. And the architect, if he wants to argue or she wants to argue, she can go do another job. But if you want the job, you start with the number of seats it has to have. Now, this was not a consideration. There were 9 major concert halls in Mozart's day. 3 or 4 of them were restaurants. The Mozart's piano concerts were premiered at restaurants. I mean, they were nice places for people to go and gather and so forth. But this whole notion of economics being so important simply didn't exist. So that what you have, of course, is a lot of halls where when they're empty, they're hopelessly over-reverberant, and when they're totally packed and standing room, they're much too dry. Marvelous thing about St. Peter's, it doesn't matter how many people are in it. Yeah. Yeah, who's the chicken, who's the egg? Well, I think it's fair to say that acoustics up till 1900 were not accidental. I mean, whatever the people who designed St. Peter's over the centuries, whatever goal they were after visually, artistically, in terms of visual art, in terms of the acoustic, they achieved it. I mean, it's a spectacular acoustic. I somehow think that if a bunch of acoustical consultants had been asked to design a 7.5-second reverb time in which the dispersion is absolutely uniform, you wouldn't have got St. Peter's. So I think it wasn't accidental up till mid-19th century, but I do think that it was natural. I do think there was a kind of organic relationship between spaces and music. I think it has become synthetic, as it were, in our century because, for 2 reasons. First of all, economics, and second, because spaces have been forced to fill more than one purpose. I mean, you had the opera house, the concert hall, the chamber music hall. You had totally separate halls. But nowadays, you go to the Chandler Pavilion to hear a chamber music series. You go there to hear a pianist, and you go there to hear 500 people on the stage. It is forced, and you hear rock things down there from time to time. It is forced to do too many things. So I think that musicians were not telling the designers of St. Peter's or of St. Florian or other places how to build the space. But somehow people understood what created the kind of acoustic they wanted. And the musicians provided them with the music that supported that acoustic. I think there was no chicken or egg. I think it was, one egg and they were both inside the shell, as it were. Nowadays, it's a much more complicated arrangement. I'll give you a very quick practical example. I do a concert series at the Getty Museum in the summer. Now, they used to do concerts in this awful Baroque, it's a wonderful gallery for paintings, but it was the black hole in terms of music. It was a Baroque gallery. Carpeting everywhere, just boom, the sound is gone. And I said, why don't you do it in this inner peristyle garden? Yeah, well, gee, that's an interesting idea. Well, they had a wonderful, Paul Veneklausen designed a fabulous canopy for that space. Now here you have this, neo-Greco-Roman space with a piece of canvas lead-lined sail, held up by guy wires that has made an absolutely wonderful space with an open top, has made an absolutely wonderful space for music. Now, I don't know who's the chicken or the egg there. I don't know if Paul Veneklausen is the chicken or the egg. Yeah. Yes, or let's put it this way. I prefer many spaces suitable for many different kinds of music. And the problem is, as you know from, look, if you go to UCLA, to Cal State Northridge, it doesn't much matter where you go, you get the same, I kind of call it, the UA, the Universal Acoustic. We all know what it is. This is not it, or this is much different. But they're this sort of standard concert hall design. And it's one that certainly has been in place since the early 1940s. It's Watson and his followers. And I oppose that only because it takes that element which has always been so important to music, that is the kind of sound that is created, and just eliminates it. That's going to make all of us poorer for the experience. So I like to see people, when they build a new space, give some thought to what they want to do in it, not how much money they want to make off of it. Well, I think both of those things are going to be taken into account. I mean, when you build a space, you're going to think about, but is it, we have to seat 700 every night or we're going to go bankrupt? I mean, if that is the basic consideration, you've already taken one measure of aesthetic choice out of the matter. It may just be that for the kind of things you want to do, that 300 seats is right, or 1,000 seats. I mean, it could well depend. I mean, honestly, one of the few places in town, how many of you know the size of Ambassador Auditorium? What does Ambassador seat? Only 1,000. It's 1/2 to 1/3 the size. I mean, given the fact that that place is so kitschy, I mean, that is the kitschest piece of, architectural, it's got marble from India and this, I mean, it's just bizarre. But somebody had the courage to say, we're loaded. We don't care if we lose money. I mean, they lose money hand over fist there when they fill the place. We're going to build a rather shallow 1,000-seat hall. Those are the best acoustics in Los Angeles, in my judgment, because somebody said, we don't give a damn whether we break even. And they don't break even. But I mean, I almost want to tithe when I see that kind of a decision made. Not quite, but I think about it. We're dwindling away, and Roland's exhibition is over there, and I'm thirsty, and we're all hungry. We'd be happy to talk. Thank you for sticking around.